Alright, hello everyone and welcome back to the second channel. I want to begin by just sincerely apologizing for the lack of content in the month of May. Seriously, I am sorry about that. I'm trying to get back to a regular schedule. I was working pretty diligently on just the main channel videos this month, and so I just apologize, and I do this as a labor of love to you guys to review the works that you send in, and I want to take that seriously because I do appreciate your guys' support. So like I said, I'm trying to get back to a regular schedule. I'm going to try to be more consistent about this because I love you guys, honestly. And I love the work that you submit, so let's hop to that, yeah? So, as always, I want to start with a disclaimer. Keep in mind, I am not a professional reviewer. I'm just some guy on the internet who likes reading and writing. The opinions expressed in this video are only opinions. My interpretation of or reaction to the work will not be the same as everyone else's, for better or for worse. I will look for the good and the bad, but no matter what I say, don't be too hard on yourself, just keep writing. And for those in the comments, please be respectful. Also, I'm so sorry for any mistakes or mispronunciations of names or words. If I come across a word that I don't want to say for whatever reason, I will replace it with the word blank. So, we've got 4 works here, as per usual, and we're going to start with this book right here. So, this is a book called Trauma and Other Teddy Bears by Roma Ayako, or Rocky Jones. Sorry, I can't exactly show you the full book. If you've been following this channel for a while, you know that if I try to mess with the zoom, the focus just unravels completely. So I apologize for that. But I like the way the book feels, like physically in my hands. It's like well bound and like it's hardcover, but like not too hardcover. I don't know. It's really hard to explain in a medium like a YouTube video. But on the back, we first have sort of an author blurb, which I enjoy. Hi, I'm Roma Ayako, or Rocky Jones. I'm a non-binary poet from Ohio. I have been writing poetry for over 9 years, and I've competed in many spoken word competitions within the greater Cincinnati area. This book is the 3rd I have published, and inside lies a collection of poems I wrote for this book. So I like it. I love having a picture there. I love getting to know the author right off the bat. One thing I don't always love on the back of a book is having this, like, reviews, basically customer reviews. I would prefer just knowing more about the book, knowing more of what I can expect, more of what's inside it, which, sure, customer reviews can provide that sort of thing sometimes, but I think just sort of a summary would be better, personally. Anyway, that's just my take. We are going to read these customer reviews real quick before we get into it. It's raw, it's emotion-packed, it's authentic. I'm completely and utterly in love with it. Roma's poems speak to the soul and beyond. These pieces are unbelievably raw. I aspire to be this courageous one day and let it all out. That's awesome. Awesome that, this book has its fans. I note that 2 of the reviews use the word raw. And as a content warning, the author told me that this book, as the title implies, touches on their trauma. And so I don't really know the specifics of that, but be advised, this could get heavy. This could get traumatic, right? And if you're interested in this book, be sure to look for it on Amazon. So if you've followed this second channel for a bit, you know that when I take a look at a poetry book, like in a store or here on the channel, I like to look at the first poem, and then I open up to a random poem, and I sort of evaluate from there. So, and we have the National Suicide Hotline number, and the dedication looks very, very tender, rather personalized. Sorry, let me read it aloud. Dedication. This book is dedicated to anyone who has lost their lives trying to heal, those still living with their demons. You are loved, you are seen, you are heard. That's really great. Really, really nice. Okay. Okay, interesting. Sorry, I started flipping through the pages and I noticed the poems sort of all have different fonts and formatting, which is neat. So as far as I can tell, I believe this is the first poem in the collection. It's called Our Game, Their Secret. Our game, just adolescent girls playing school. I was always the youngest, always the student, watched as they kissed in front of me, until I was encouraged to learn hands-on, as my lips too were intertwined with theirs. I remember the humping and heavy breathing, confused as to what my body was feeling. I remember being shamed for being too curious and so young, always quiet about the molestation. I remember inflicting the same stupidity onto another, unknowing of the wrongness, unknowing how raw my skin would be after being beaten. I remember being blamed for actions done onto me, too young to understand that the repetition wasn't normal, and that families should never play. I remember the shame and the silence and the crying. Okay. Oh, sorry, keeps going. I remember my mother saying, "You deserved this," as she washed my welted back clean. I learned that no matter how much it hurts, it will always be my burden, no matter how the story is told. Wow. Definitely raw. I already agree with the reviews on the back of the book. It's almost hard for me to comment on poems like these because I can tell just how much the author put themselves into this, and that's really, really admirable, like seriously. One thing I noticed right off the bat that was interesting to me, an interesting use of language, was this line here. I remember being blamed for actions done onto me. I thought that was an interesting use of prepositions there, because usually you would say done to me, right, in theory. So done onto me is kind of interesting because it makes the speaker almost more objectified. It sort of strips them of their agency even further than if you were to just say done to me. So I think that is interesting for sure. It's pretty simple, right? It's written in pretty straightforward language, and at the same time it's not giving too much to the reader, right? Because it would be easy for a poem like this. First of all, it is shocking, but it would be easy to make it pure shock, and I don't think it's pure shock. I think the poem gives where it needs to give and withholds where it needs to withhold, if that makes sense. There's not too much here. Like I said, it would be easy to make this shocking, and while it is a little shocking, the author withholds the easiness of it, right? I hope I'm making sense with that. But as far as other things to mention, there is the repeated use of the phrase, or just the two words, I remember, right? That continues throughout the poem multiple times. And of course, I've said this many times, but repetition isn't my favorite. Here, I actually don't hate it because there is kind of enough between each repeated use that you almost kind of forget, right? You almost don't realize on a first reading that the phrase is being repeated over and over again. There is really traumatic stuff here, so the poem definitely lives up to the title. And honestly, like this is probably a good poem to open the collection with. We haven't seen everything the collection has to offer yet, but I assume this is a good tone setter. I think I had another point along those same lines, just about the tone that's being set here, how it's tough, it's hard to read, right? Especially this last section. I remember my mother saying, "You deserved this." Like, how awful. That's so hard. Yeah, to be punished for something that really wasn't even your fault, right? So there is a lot of good going on here. As I said, there is a fine balance going on here of what the reader needs to understand and what the author needs to give in order to provide that understanding. So, good stuff. Hard stuff, obviously, to read, but I did enjoy that. If you are looking for something raw to read, I mean, that's on the nose, right? So let's open up to a random one now. Okay, this one looks interesting. It's called Restless Sleep. Nowadays, I catch myself hiding my feelings behind smoke, Blunts I never put in for. I'm one unwashed dish from being homeless. In a city I ran away from my problems to be in. I barricade myself away from society's shoulder. Careful not to cry in public or in person. I've stopped cutting, but also eating, only living to keep the ones I love alive. My shoulders are always shrugged, hands always tied, mind always far away in a made-up place. My birthday was a few months ago, and I wished for family before I blew out the candles in my sister's single-bedroom apartment. Most nights I pray to whoever listens, utter apologies to the moonlight. I am one night's sleep away from suicide. Once again, really raw, really difficult to read. I noted before I read it, I said it looked interesting. And I said that for the format where the words are spaced out from each other further than they would be in, say, an essay or formal writing, non-poetry, right? And that sort of gives the poem like a stuttering feeling. Not stuttering exactly, but as if there were a pause between each of these words, as if the speaker is having as hard time of saying this as the reader is probably reading it, right? One thing I noticed, kind of dissimilar to the last poem, the first one in the collection, was some repetition. Where was it? Oh, the repeated use of the word always. My shoulders are always shrugged, hands always tied, mind always far away in a made-up place. I think always is a word that probably has some more interesting alternatives, right? And so to use it 3 times in succession there, I think there's something else that could be done there. There are other options there, is all I'm trying to say. And I understand, the intent, and obviously it makes sense. And to that point, I'll say once again, this poem is written in pretty simple language, but at the same time, there are some figurative devices at play here. I think this is a good opener. I catch myself hiding my feelings behind smoke. And then, in the next line, it clarifies via blunts. And honestly, blunts could have a double meaning. But just this visual of hiding something behind smoke, I think that's a neat visual. It's a pretty intriguing opening line. And I think I've talked on this channel before about how important it is to have a hook, whether you're writing a poem, a short story, a novel, whatever it is. So that's a pretty decent hook. And then this phrase, I'm one unwashed dish from being homeless. I don't know what it is about that phrase, but I just find it, again, just a striking visual, right? That I like the link there, because one wouldn't usually link the possession of dishes with the possession of a home, right? And so I think the implications there are really cool. Once again, it's withholding enough, right? It says enough without saying too much. So really neat there. There are some other ones too, like society's shoulder is kind of an interesting personification. Oh, and yeah, this one I really liked too. Sort of a juxtaposition here where the speaker says they wish for family, and yet they're in their sister's apartment. So that sort of suggests that the sister is not family, right? And so that's an interesting series of lines there, so close together. So, as the title implied, trauma, right? And I didn't really mention the title beyond the word trauma there, but Trauma and Other Teddy Bears. It's a juxtaposition, right? Teddy bears sound really pleasant. They sound like something that a kid would want. Trauma sounds like the opposite. And of course, you have a tiny bit of alliteration there too, with the T sound repeated. So it's a pretty good title, and much like the first poem, it sort of keys you into what the book is going to be about. So again, short poems written in pretty simple language as far as the two that we read represent. And there is a market for that. I noticed the author said that they were a spoken word poet, or that they've competed in spoken word competitions. I do wonder how these would sound spoken. I say that as I have spoken them. Keep in mind, I am not a spoken word poet. I just read them as is. I guess what I'm trying to say is, are these meant to be spoken, right? And if so, what are the elements that enhance that effect, right? Which words, which sounds? I think those the two can be blended, right? Written poetry and spoken poetry. They're not too far off from each other, right? They're both about words, about the feelings and emotions that words evoke. And so I really like when spoken word elements are applied to the written word and vice versa. So it would be interesting to see if there's more of that within some of the other poems in the book. But yeah. Roma, I really want to thank you for sending this one in. Once again, folks, you can take a look at this book over on Amazon. It looks like it would be a pretty short read altogether. But yeah, thanks a bunch for sending it. Really heavy stuff, and I think I said this with the first poem, but it's really admirable that you would just put so much of yourself out there like that, and I'm sure that that was, I hope, therapeutic for you in a lot of ways. So, good start to this video. Let's move to, let's do a short story next. Actually, nah, we'll do a poem first, then the short story. This is a poem called Faithless, and it's by, the author goes by JT, lowercase j, period T. And they also have an Instagram page. Sorry, the focus is not focusing. Yeah. Oh, there we go. Okay, so their Instagram is Croctears, except with a 0 instead of an O. So CR0CTEARS on Instagram, Croctears on Instagram. And once again, this is a poem called Faithless. As far as content warnings go, the author did mention that this was written regarding abortion, but they also emphasize that it's not explicit. So just keep that in mind. As far as other notes, the author mentioned that this is one of their first few attempts at poetry. They wrote, "I'm a prose writer testing this out." So, super cool. Faithless. I placed her in the ribs of the unworthy, of the fibber, where honeyed lies dripped, down the plush of her flesh unto the pure. Among she found and made do. Arranged were the guts into a home, into a bed. In there she dwelled, with the heinous, to the heinous, the nectar swabbed, pliant as sacrifice. Behind closed doors conceived was death. A moment, a nod, a bargain, mellowed meat sold for a meager. I placed her, where the spine was spineless, where the spine pierced the diaphragm. I placed her, where makeshift abodes dissolve at dry heaves of dizzy morns. You were placed within me, the unworthy, the coward, where vacant tears scour my insides, all to douse and drown your frets. There you ebbed and swelled. Vigor was your name, ensnared to my walls. There you dwelled, with the despaired, and to the despaired. The light seized, partial as a sacrifice. Behind closed doors, death triumphed, stolen breaths, plans, dreams, gentle pulp robbed for a selfish pulse. I placed you, where sunlight never reaches your eyes, where mud never stains your shoes. I placed you where my grave turns cold, without your blanket bouquets, and you'll never see my face, and me, yours. Okay, interesting. So, right off the bat, I feel like drawing comparisons to the Garden of Eden and Eve a little bit. But let's take a closer look and see what we can find. So, faithless. I placed her in the ribs of the unworthy, of the fibber, where honeyed lies dripped. So, first of all, rib, right? That's one of the reasons I think of Garden of Eden, because according to the Bible, Eve was created out of Adam's rib, right? And yet here, it's kind of the opposite, where rather than being created from a rib, the speaker says that this subject was placed inside of ribs, like in the rib cage of the unworthy, of the liar. It's interesting that it says honeyed lies. That kind of sounds like, maybe a good lie, a moral lie. Like, I don't know, when you tell someone they look nice even if you don't think so, right? I don't know, something like that. Down the plush of her flesh unto the pure. Maybe I'm misunderstanding, but already that's kind of escaping me a little bit. So the subject is in the ribs of the unworthy, of a liar, and the lies drip down the plush of her flesh unto the pure. I guess I just don't completely understand the visual, where if the subject is in a rib cage, how do the lies drip off of her and onto the pure, right? Maybe that's nitpicking. It does sound nice. It has a nice ring to it, like, definitely. The next lines continue. Among she found and made do. Arranged were the guts into a home, into a bed. And there she dwelled, with the heinous, to the heinous, the nectar swabbed, pliant as sacrifice. Okay, so maybe it doesn't mean literal ribs. Maybe this is, a wider metaphor, where it sounds like this subject is sort of a Christ figure, where, like, Jesus was called to preach to the unworthy, the unclean, the people that his contemporaries would have prejudices against. And so, again, maybe that's the parallel. That's where this subject is supposed to be. And the rib cage is just a wider metaphor for that. And so to say that, she's living among guts, with the heinous to the heinous, right? Yeah, I'm going to take it as that, because it can't be one literal rib cage. Otherwise, there would, be no one in there with her. And I assume the heinous are other subjects rather than just the insides of one person. The nectar swabbed, pliant as sacrifice. So that word sacrifice is pretty charged. That also brings, Christ imagery to mind. And I do like the phrase, the nectar swabbed. That's kind of interesting. Especially if we are thinking about this as a literal rib cage. But the next lines, so I'm torn as to whether to think of it as a wider metaphor or exactly how we're supposed to be picturing this. Anyway, moving on. Behind closed doors conceived was death, a moment, a nod, a bargain, mellowed meat sold for a meager. So again, that to me sort of conjures Garden of Eden imagery, where Eve trades away her immortality for the forbidden fruit, for knowledge, right? Depending on your interpretation. I placed her where the spine was spineless, where the spine pierced the diaphragm. Much like one of the last poems I mentioned there. Putting spine twice in a row, slightly repetitive. And to say where the spine, I honestly think there's another word that could go in place of spine. But, and on that same note, I placed her, and you've got the dash, which kind of is reminiscent of Dickinson. Where makeshift abodes dissolve at dry heaves of dizzy morns. Oh, you know what? Something is occurring to me now where the author mentioned that this had reference to abortions. And I had forgotten that, but now it's kind of coming back into play, at least in my mind, because of dry heaves and dizzy mourns. That evokes imagery of pregnancy, right? So let's see. I placed her in the ribs of the unworthy of the fibber, where honeyed lies dripped down the plush of her flesh unto the pure. Among she found and made due, arranged were the guts, into a home, into a bed. In there she dwelled with the heinous, to the heinous, the nectar swabbed, pliant as sacrifice. So it sounds like a real condemnation of whoever's carrying this baby. At least that's how it sounds to start, right? It sounds like this woman is a liar, or, they might not be a woman, just someone capable of giving birth, right? Not to be pedantic, but that is possible. Behind closed doors conceived was death, a moment, a nod, a bargain, mellowed meat sold for a meager. I placed her where the spine was spineless. Yeah, so again, that almost sounds like the speaker is calling the mother spineless. Where the spine pierced the diaphragm, I placed her where makeshift abodes dissolve at dry heaves of dizzy mourns. Going on from there. You were placed within me, the unworthy, the coward, where vacant tears scour my insides, all to douse and drown your frets. There you ebbed and swelled, vigor was your name, ensnared to my walls. There you dwelled with the despaired, and to the despaired the light seized, partial as sacrifice. Okay, before I analyze any further, I should point out, and I think this is clear, I'm a man. I've always identified as a man. I was assigned male at birth, right? And so when it comes to the topic of abortion, I just simply will never know what that's like on a personal level. It's something I'll never even have to consider, right? And so I might be off the mark with anything that I say regarding this piece. But as I read this stanza, it sounds like it's the mother who's speaking, or the person carrying the baby, right? They call themselves the unworthy, the coward, and maybe if you were a person having an abortion, you might feel those feelings, even if you had like every valid reason in the world to get an abortion. Because like I said, I can't understand what that's like. I think it must be a hard thing to do, no matter who you are, no matter if you want the abortion or not. Like I said, I don't know for sure. And honestly, please correct me if I am off the mark here. But like I said, this might be an accurate depiction of how a person feels when considering an abortion. And so once again, we see the word sacrifice. And so with this imagery and language in mind, it sounds as though this baby who's being aborted, or this mass of cells that's being aborted, is considered a sacrifice, or as in they're giving up their life for the mother or for the parents, right? I don't know. It's just hard because, like, if you think that life begins at conception, then that reading of the poem holds up, right? But if you don't believe that, which a lot of people don't, including medical experts, then that reading of the poem doesn't come off right? Because if there is no life at that point in the early stages, right, then really there is no sacrifice being made. And so a lot of it just comes down to one's opinions on abortion. And so this poem, in theory, might not land with a lot of people, assuming I'm even interpreting it correctly up to this point. We do have a few more lines to go. It continues. Behind closed doors, death triumphed, stolen breaths, plans, dreams, gentle pulp robbed for a selfish pulse. I placed you where sunlight never reaches your eyes, where mud never stains your shoes. I placed you where my grave turns cold, without your blanket bouquets, and you'll never see my face and me yours. Okay. So like I said, there are probably a lot of feelings. Again, I must emphasize, a lot of feelings that I cannot understand and that I probably never will understand. There are probably a lot of feelings involved when a person decides to get an abortion. And maybe this poem does describe some of them very poignantly. But at the same time, I can't see myself agreeing with the entire sentiment of this poem, where it kind of seems like the speaker in this poem thinks that getting an abortion is a selfish thing to do. And I just don't think that that's always the case. Even like, for one thing, if a mother's life is in danger, is it selfish of them at that point to get an abortion, right? If the baby might be born, I don't know. I'm really not qualified to talk at length about this. All I know is, like I said, this poem probably will not land with every reader. And frankly, I'm curious to hear other people's thoughts on this, just on this poem in general. If you think my reading is accurate, and if not, what is your reading of the piece? And, it is brave to write a poem about something so controversial. And that's a lot of what poetry is all about, right? Is trying to put words to things that are difficult. Yeah, like I said, I just don't think I can get behind the apparent message of this poem, which, as it kind of says explicitly, robbed for a selfish pulse. Like I said, I really don't think that selfishness is what propels people to get abortions. I don't know. I don't think that's a controversial thing to say, but with the conversation around abortion these days, I'm sure a lot of people would take that in a very, I don't know, personal way. Yeah, like I said, abortion is controversial. And to make it clear, I think it should be a right, and people who are anti-abortion, to me, it just seems that it's only about controlling women, right? If it were really about children, then why isn't there more care provided for children in the United States, right? Specifically in the United States, and I know across the world this is a problem too. And that's another thing we could consider, right? What's the quality of life on a baby in the United States, especially when that baby is born to a mother who doesn't feel equipped to have a child in the first place, right? And I mentioned this actually in the Shel Silverstein video a little bit, where he has the poem, I think it's called The Gulu Bird, where the bird can't land, but it has to keep laying eggs. And I think that's a pretty poignant metaphor for women who are forced to have children who can't land on their feet, right? They just aren't equipped to be able to raise a child. So anyway, I'm sorry. I didn't expect this to be so heavy. Yeah, I guess there was a content warning to start. But like I said, I actually am curious to hear everybody else's thoughts here. Yeah, let's go ahead and move to our next piece. Oh, but one more time, the author on that one was JT. And thank you for submitting that. If I am reading it correctly, you might have anticipated that there would be some pushback. And so truly it's brave of anyone to, submit their work for criticism, right? But especially to somebody who might disagree with your work. And even though I disagree with the premise, I think there were some pretty good poetic devices used in there. Anyway, sorry. Kind of got off on a tangent there. But last thing I wanted to say, this came to us from Croc Tears on Instagram. That's CR0CTEARS. Again, I'll just add this. If you, dear viewer, think that I'm misinterpreting this poem, or if I said anything that rubbed you the wrong way, I'd like to know. And remember, please keep it civil in those comments. But let's move on to our short story. I think I mentioned this in the last video, but I try not to spend more than 40 minutes on any one given piece, unless it's like from one of my patrons. So this is a little lengthy. We're just kind of going to see how much of it we can get through. But this is a short story by Yuto. The title is in French. I'm going to do my best to pronounce it. It's not written here. It was only written in the submission file. But I think it's... No, I can't even say that with confidence. I don't know how this is pronounced. I don't speak French. I'm going to read it to the best of my ability. J'ai eu un coup de foudre. Something like that. As far as content warnings go, so, sorry, I don't mean to laugh. The first content warning is homophobia. The reason I laugh is because the next content warning was just French. So, be advised, there is French in this story. I thought it was funny that the author they put French as a content warning. As far as notes that the author puts, they said, "This is one of the first short stories I have actually come back to and finished, and is actually the third rebuild of the whole story." Awesome. We love rewrites, right? That's the hardest and most important part of writing is rewriting. So it was scrapped several times within the first few paragraphs before a sudden onset of neuroticism and inspiration forced my hand for several days to work on it, though I am glad to finally complete it. Hopefully it isn't too bad. Well, hey, if this is the third draft, I think you can at least take solace in knowing it was better than the second draft, better than the first draft, probably, right? I can't say that for a fact because I haven't seen the second or the first draft, and I'm only about to see the third one. But I think you should feel proud for revisiting it, for finishing it, and not just finishing it once, but finishing it 3 times, technically, right? So let's get into it. A man had already ascertained his fate, and yet continued to defy it at every corner, until it suffocated him. Such was the life of Ansel Arsenault, one of the barkeepers at a small bar within the Vegasian district of City 4U, and a man whose past had been kept secret even to his closest allies. Okay, pretty decent hook. A man had already ascertained his fate and yet continued to defy it at every corner until it suffocated him. It's a tiny bit generic, but it's kind of interesting. And the next line, if a reader is hooked enough to read the next line, kind of gives us an indication as to the setting. It sounds like this is sci-fi-ish. I like City 4U. Oh, and city is spelled with a 1, which I didn't even notice. City 4U makes it almost sound kind of dystopian, but it's trying to convince you that it's not a dystopia, right? Like, this is the city for you. But anyhow, let's keep going. It was as though he simply drifted to and fro with the wind, leaving behind every home, every friend, every enemy, and every debt he ever owed behind as he moved frequently. Each step would suffocate him until he finally broke through and left it all behind, as though he shed an outer layer and could once more bask in freedom. And once more in his life was another day of work, another day of cooking, another day of satiating the hunger of his patrons and changing their lives for but a fleeting moment. Okay, I kind of like that. Just this idea that even someone as simple as a bartender could have an effect on other people, an effect that they probably don't realize or appreciate, but one that is good, right? I note the syntax here. These sentences are pretty lengthy, which is fine. You know, all authors have their styles, but it's really easy for a reader to get lost in a long sentence. So I noticed that with not this sentence, but with the last one in particular. A lot of commas, some lists, some repetition, and then a semicolon, some more repetition after that. But yeah, so that's just something to keep in mind. Simplicity, right? And yet he yearned for something more than just his toil at the stove or the constant chase of his sins. He yearned for that one feeling of liberty he had at one point in his life. He was entranced at the thought for quite a bit, almost allowing some seafood he was stir-frying at the small stovetop atop the bar counter to burn. Okay, That sounds a little bit like telling rather than showing. I think kind of the quintessential example of like the main character who yearns for adventure. I think first of Luke Skywalker, and rather than just telling us that he yearns for adventure, we get the beautiful scene where he looks out into the twin sunsets as his theme plays, and it's like he clearly wants more, right? He's wondering what's beyond the horizon there. So yeah, I think there's a better way to communicate the main character's feelings here than just saying it like this. You're awfully distracted today, his coworker observed, a woman who was typically referred to as Abby. Did I slip you too much liquor? Her remarks weren't to slight him in the slightest. That's just kind of funny, having slight and slightest so close together. As Ansel did possess a habit of tasting the various spirits they had, as a way to steady his mind. Not at all. Ansel's words were short and to the point as he always spoke, tone unchanged despite his small daydream nearly ruining a dish, sorry. Okay, so apparently Ansel speaks short and to the point. If that's true, I think that's great, because then we'll have sort of a contrast in the way that the narrator speaks and the way that the main character speaks. So I hope that's true, because it would kind of show the dexterity of the author, the ability to diversify, right? The ability to write with different types of syntax. So let's find out. Without uttering another word, and within another minute, he finished the small dish consisting of stir-fried shrimp and zucchini. Cooking had always been his solace following his short tenure as a mercenary, a previous occupation of which he was glad to retire from. He placed his creation on a plate, scratching at his gruff stubble and setting aside the plate with a set of utensils before proceeding to turn around and use the installed sink to wash his hands. So once again, as far as telling and not showing, maybe there's a more interesting way to communicate to the audience that Ansel used to be a mercenary. Like maybe as part of his like cooking job, he's repurposed, I don't know, a weapon or something. Or maybe he's hiding something, or he brought, I don't know, some of his old mercenary gear to work by accident, and then he has to hide it, and that reminds him of what he used to be. I don't know. You got options, right? Just want to get through the shift and get home. I'm exhausted, Ansel thought as he exhaled in a rather labored manner before moving around to the other side of the counter, as though he were a customer. Okay, relatable. I work a day job outside of YouTube, and yeah, Ansel is on the money there for sure. He sat upon one of the stools and reached over for his plate and utensils, taking them with a small smile and beginning to dine on it. Did you get any sleep last night? You're looking a bit tired, more than usual at least. Abby was standing behind the counter still, drying out a tumbler with a rag, leaning on the counter and propped up on her left arm as she did so. I think you would just want to rephrase that as, like, propped up on her left arm as she often did, or as she often was. Slept just right, Cher. No need to worry about me. He produced a faint smile, just something to ease her mind. Abby would shrug and continue on, humming a small tune as she continued her cleaning, deciding that Ansel's answer was sufficient. Eventually it all ended, and they both were standing in silence once more, behind the counter and simply waiting to close up when their shifts were soon to end. So, began Abigail in her usual position of leaning on the bar counter, what do you have planned after work? Ansel pondered for a second before responding, probably continue reading the book I started recently, either that or prep a meal for the week. You cook a lot just for work. Why bother with that? I'd rather not spend the money on a meal, and I can just heat it up. Well, besides that, no one to hang out with? Abby moved her hands below the counter and pulled out 2 glasses along with a bottle of Claire de Lune 15-year cognac, pouring both of them a glass to enjoy their conversation. They're working at the moment, so no, not until later. Ansel would scratch at his stubble again before grasping the glass, first aerating it, taking in its scent, and finally sipping it as though it were a fine wine. What about that chick that came in earlier that you talked to? Abigail said while developing a somewhat cheeky smirk. What chick? Ansel placed his glass down onto the counter slowly, making sure to make eye contact with Abigail as he replied. You know, she would do the same, facing Ansel and staring back. The blondie with the short hair, the one you talked to for like an hour or two. He's a man, and I would rather not say. His face became stern in tone, rather stone-cold, with the mood of the conversation befitting of an interrogation. Ah, and is he something significant to you, or just a friend? Or are you gonna say, just a friend, to throw me off? That's none of your business, Cher. Besides, why does it matter to you? Just want to know is all. Don't be so mad. She decided to act quite impudent, her grin growing wide and a laugh following her words. Ansel was starting to become visibly annoyed, though he instead let it all go with a sigh and sipped the cognac once more, placing a hand into his right pocket and inspecting a few messages on his smartphone before putting it back. This girl, he thought, she's being quite a handful tonight. I'd recommend you drop him from our discussion. He's got nothing to do with what we were talking about, began Ansel. Besides, don't you have plans after our shift? Abigail moved her hand up to her chin, tapping her lips gently with her index finger as she was formulating her response. Well, I was going to just head back home and take a nap before turning into Arena-sama's new stream. But that Eliza girl from Aiko's company had asked me to go with her to an event. I mean, did you see her face when I said I'd consider? I couldn't say no to that. You get moved too easily, Mademoiselle Abby, but I suppose I appreciate you helping her. She does seem a bit lonely at times. Ansel also gave her a rather condescending smile with his own reply, though he was still very, very much annoyed. Says you, Mr. Frenchie. You went and ignored some of our esteemed customers to talk to your boyfriend. She drank the rest of her cognac as if it was juice, downing the glass and cleaning it swiftly, her grin being wiped off her face almost immediately, instead replaced with embarrassment. So, before we move on, I've said this about other short stories on the channel, just about how dialogue is just a good way to keep momentum, right? I find that a lot of short stories kind of suffer if they don't have enough dialogue, right? Not all the time, but just in general, dialogue is a good way to get insight into characters. It's a good way to keep the story progressing in a way that feels natural, right? And, you know, these characters are expositing too. They are telling vital information to the audience. And at the same time, it doesn't really feel that way, like to me as a reader anyway. It just feels like, you know, this is something these characters do. They talk like this all the time, presumably. And so this is just good insight into the world, into the characters, and it's providing us with information in a way that doesn't feel stilted or boring, right? There's sort of a rhythm to this conversation. So I think this is a pretty effective use of dialogue, personally. Moving on. Let's ignore that as well for now. How about we change de sujet? I don't know. I'm sure we can discuss something else as we close up. It's almost time for that anyhow. He'd finished his cognac as well, though in a more delicate manner as he took his time to sip and aerate the liquor, and finally handing his glass to Abigail for her to also clean. That sentence reads a little bit awkwardly at the end there. The two would only engage in small talk as they worked through the later portion of their shift, only cleaning, maintaining, and refilling the bar taps, along with other mundane tasks to end their evening of work. After another round of odd pleasantries, Ansel would be the first to exit, with Abigail choosing to be the one to close up fully. This gave him some unusual freedom, of which he did not know how to utilize at the time. He began to walk towards his car, where he would see a familiar face sitting on the hood of his car, who appeared to be waiting for him. Hey, you took so long and made me wait in the cold. That's quite mean. The one at the hood of his car was a rather short and dainty figure with short blonde hair that had nearly grown over their ears, and was dressed in a rather long and dark coat, made of a tough synthetic fabric and dyed black, making both their lower body and torso quite hard to distinguish from the side aspect. However, their face was still visible, and appeared sharp, narrow, with features accentuated by soft skin and a rounded jaw, akin to a young girl. I did not expect you here. Ansel approached the figure and took his arms into his own, holding on before initiating their embrace. Tu es ravissant, monsieur, he whispered into Pavel's ear during the hug. Oh, yeah, no, I'm sorry. Looks like Russian. I'm not sure, but I'm not even going to attempt it. And you always make me tremble with those words of yours, Pavel whispered in reply, gasping onto Ansel's uniform before finally letting go and stepping out of the embrace, of which Ansel allowed. Within short distance, and with a frontal aspect, more of Pavel's outfit was revealed. He wore a pair of dark blue jeans which had fit rather high above his waist, a buttoned-up and white blouse of which was tucked into jeans, and provided a bright contrast to the rest of his appearance. And finally, a pair of brown Oxfords completed the sophisticated yet distinctively homespun look of Pavel Oni Schwernik. Pavel appeared rather heated from Ansel's approach, as though the Frenchman's presence was enough to drive him into a frenzy of tension. "Why are you here, mon chéri? Did I not tell you that I would drive to you?" Ansel appeared elated, though still confused at their meeting, as it deviated from their original plans and was likely influenced by their previous encounter during his shift. "For you, I couldn't stand waiting for you." Pavel once more threw himself onto Ansel, embracing him in a rather constricting manner, before allowing some room and trailing his hand around Ansel's upper back. "It appears you ended up waiting for me after all." "Yes, but that was because of you." "You already knew that I have long shifts, mon chéri." Ansel would accept the embrace and clutch unto Pavel in return, though placing a light-hearted and endearing kiss to Pavel's forehead. The act made Pavel somewhat uptight, growing a little giddy despite the gestures. Inherent, tender-hearted nature. "Come on, then, we should go somewhere. La lune est pleine ce soir, et lumineuse." "What location is it that you have in mind?" Pavel's flusteredness was apparent, as his speech was more and more calculated, with pauses accentuating the already noticeable change in behavior. Okay, just a quick pause. So let's see. We're 3 pages into the story now, and it's a 9-page story. And there's not exactly a sign of conflict here, and story conventions are evolving all the time. A lot of times these days, stories don't have conflict in the traditional sense, especially as the whole slice of life genre grows more popular. And maybe that's what this is. Maybe this is just sort of slice of life. We don't know yet for sure. But this is another reason that I will often suggest starting in the middle. And that's really common writing advice. Start your story in the middle, right? And medi res. It's just an easy way to hook the audience. And it also tells the audience that, if you make it through all the setup, all the exposition, then you're in for something really exciting, right? If you start the story with exciting, the reader knows that it will continue to be exciting. So anyhow, like I said, the dialogue is good, and it comes off as believable, in my opinion. It seems like these two are lovers. And maybe I stopped in an inopportune time, because it sounds like we might actually be right before the conflict. I guess we'll find out here in just a second. But yeah, it could be easy to lose a reader at this juncture, depending on how long your story is and what the whole plot line and plot structure looks like. So just another thing to keep in mind. Continuing on. "Well, that is one of the problems at the moment." Ansel's eyes seemed to wander, veering off to the side as he let out a sigh. "We've been about everywhere in this city. I want you to experience something different, mon amour. I do not mind wherever you take me. I only want to be with you." His eyes appeared... I think you want the word "to" there. His eyes appeared to veer off as well, however more towards Ansel's chest and clothing, as though he was enraptured by his tie or neck. "We can go back to that vehicle depot and rent out the BTR again, then drive around the countryside to see if we find anything interesting. I believe I told you there were some interesting androids, something you would like, I'm sure." Pavel's gaze remained affixed towards Ansel's chest, even disregarding the disparity in height, as he appeared mesmerized with every centimeter of Ansel's presence. "Haha, but I think you just want me to give you driving lessons again. You see through me, and yet you never fail to amuse it. Ansel would proceed to move his hand down to Pavel's waist, encouraging him to move closer, and under all the neon lights, in what could be described as a sea of people, they held one another for what felt like forever. Their moment would soon be interrupted by a sudden start of rain, causing Ansel to look up towards the sky. Look, it's a sign for us to get going, mon chéri. I do not mind the rain. Let us stay like this a little more. Pavel clung on, as though he were a child to his mother, of which ended with Ansel sighing and proceeding to reach into his left pocket and fiddle with his key fob in his pocket, unlocking the passenger side door and maneuvering themselves so as to open and eventually push Pavel in halfway. Again, I think this is kind of one of the dangers of really long sentences, is like a lot of that came off as a little bit clunky and just a little bit hard to follow. So it starts, Pavel clung on as though he were a child to his mother, of which ended with, that is just an awkward phrase, of which ended with, Ansel sighing and proceeding to, this next portion, reach into his left pocket and fiddle with his key fob in his pocket. It's like the reader already knows that his hand is in his pocket, right? The key fob is in his pocket. That's just repeated information. Unlocking the passenger side door and maneuvering themselves so as to open and eventually push Pavel in halfway. Again, that last phrase too just feels like a series of words that really need to be tightened up, right? Just to keep the reader understanding what's even happening there. Like, what is the maneuvering? What's the movement going on? It's kind of hard to follow as is. But anyway. Pavel would finally let go and sit with his legs crossed over one another, though with his arms crossed, expressing some disappointment in Ansel's decision. Ansel would only respond in kind with a faint smile. Ansel would then close the door and move to the driver's side, getting in as well before buckling in and starting the car, letting out a sigh as he began to tinker with the radio, tuning to various different local stations. Hate this part of driving. Do you think you can find something for us, Cher? He would then shift into reverse and slowly back up, before shifting to drive and subsequently beginning their trip as he merged into traffic, moving along at a relatively paltry pace. Pavel would comply and continuously rotate the tuning knob before finally settling for a station, playing a song with the title of 8th Class Narcotic Love. The accompanying beat that emitted from the speakers of the car was of a paradoxical deep mellowness, a cacophony of various synths, some strobing, some remaining constant, with a melodic 808 rhythm pounding away within the background. Okay, I appreciate the dive into imagery there. Could be beneficial to have even more imagery previous to this, especially to kind of situate ourselves in the scene. You know, what does this look like? The scene before where the two were standing out in the rain, what did that look like exactly? That would potentially be beneficial for a reader to know. But at the same time, like, you know, it might add something to the story for a reader to know that, but I understood decently well even without that description there. So moving on. Within a few seconds of the song, a singer would begin to utter the lyrics, with Pavel following along as he stared at the horizon alongside Ansel once he heard the chorus. You've left me deprived, but still alive. Need more of your love. It's but a drug. Ansel's right arm would move onto the center console of the car, of which Pavel would suddenly, again, of which, it's just an awkward thing to say, of which Pavel would suddenly cling onto without hesitation, as though he had nothing else left. He would lean in as best he could before continuing with the chorus whilst attempting to match the voice of the female singer. It's all you do, you pull me through, barely alive, you stay the night. Ansel would let out a soft chuckle as Pavel went on, as an audible sigh would also emit from Pavel from Ansel's dull response, as he proceeded to sulk whilst still attached to Ansel. A veil of silence seemed to smother the atmosphere. only somewhat disrupted by the muted music from the car's stereo system, a stagnant air encompassed by an odd synthetic scent, and the fading odors of Pavel's perfume and Ansel's cologne. Monsieur Schwernick, you cling tight to me, Ansel began, attempting to shift the atmosphere. Is it a crime to do so? It is not. It is quite lovely. Ah, but do you have a thirst? I am sure you are not slaked. Pavel appeared to shake his head, of which Ansel was able to feel. Yes, you are correct. I am going to guess you brought the drinks this time. Okay, so I noticed the author sort of uses this little phrase, of which, a lot. I think you just want to find something to replace that. Like I've said before, it just comes off as a little bit awkward. Anyway, moving on. Panache, and some of your laka, that finished drink you hold quite dear. You know my tastes so well, and still you decide to buy the drinks when I have to pay you back for last time. Nonsense, mon chéri. You don't need to give me anything in return. I want you to indulge when I am with you. Excuse me. Pavel seemed rather dispirited by the words, despite their uplifting nature, his grip lessening on Ansel's arm. And so the rest of the drive was uneventful, with that stagnant and faint air hanging over them, until they reached the depot. The depot was settled in an industrial area in the southern parts of District 5, an area called Section 88, known for its corruption and arms dealers. This was where Ansel's contact and preferred arms dealer was, who ran a military surplus depot along with hosting a few backwater PMCs, vehicles as well, of which the arms dealer would sometimes scrap from. They pulled into the depot and parked in a neat and empty lot near the front of the gate, surrounded by both chain-link fence and decommissioned AFVs, sitting around for spare parts. With a slight nudge to Pavel, who finally let go of his arm. Ansel would exit the car, with Pavel soon following, making sure to lock his car as he motioned for Pavel to stick close, and proceed towards the little stand where the pompous Russian sat on his tripod foldable chair, still reading the same Japanese light novel series as he so enjoyed. Again, you can just eliminate the word as there, right? The same Japanese light novel series he so enjoyed. It is a good evening, isn't it, Victor? Ansel approached with a snide smile, though his was not picked up on as an insult by the slightly overweight Russian, who finally put down his light novel and responded in kind with a handshake and smile. It certainly is. What brings you here? Do you have need for American helicopter again? Victor, the Russian, pointed towards a lot at the farthest end of the depot, which was a helipad, and then towards the back of the little building he sat in, where a board sat, displaying the various prices of all vehicles and other equipments in several currencies. Of course, you know the price of all. Not today, Victor. I am here to rent the BTR 80 again. My stamp card says I am due for a free rental. Without much time wasted, Ansel reached into his back pocket and handed the small card to Victor, who took it gingerly and examined it. Me and Pavel here are planning for a nice date tonight. Anywhere comes to mind? Ah, you say for date. In that case, Victor would place the card into a recess in his old cash register before fiddling with various clanking keys under the counter. There are few plateaus you should be able to drive to in the BTR. They are in the country, of course, but you will see them from old farmlands. He would finally place the keys on the counter before picking up a bottle of and taking a hefty quaff of it, shaking his head and letting out an exhale of content. Thanks, Victor. Ansel would wrap his arm around Pavel and caress it gently before stepping in and taking the keys, though before he could walk away, Victor would almost cry out from behind the counter. One more thing. I had a feeling you were in bed with so I prepared BTR for you. There is a small bed in there anyways, because the troop bench was cut out for scrap, and you have table too. Do not worry, your openness will not affect you as customer here, nor as friend, but I will have to ask you to be careful what hours you come here. Some clients do not like men as you. There was a rather solemn and choked air hanging over them now, as though Victor had seemingly betrayed the two of them. Ansel's smile appeared to sag as he somewhat frowned, though he kept it as best as he could, as he responded to Victor, "Thanks, Vic, I'll keep that in mind." Victor would wave them off, though Ansel would not turn to acknowledge it this time, instead keeping Pavel by his side and walking quite stern towards the BTR, which sat just a few paces away from them. "I do not like that man. He is rude to me." Pavel scowled and seemed to glare at Victor as they walked, getting his teeth to hold back a few choice words. I am sorry, mon chéri. I always thought he was a better man than that." Ansel tried to soothe Pavel by rubbing his arm in an awkward side-on embrace. Pavel would only return it with a rather exasperated sigh. Oh, excuse me, sorry. They entered the BTR without much trouble, with Pavel entering the driver's seat and Ansel handing him the keys to it, with him exiting and coming back with a small duffel bag in a few short moments. Pavel started up the vehicle without much time spared as he began to back out and exit the depot, showing off his experience with driving the AFV as he entered traffic as though it were a normal car. Again, just a little bit wordy there. There was not much said as they drove through the rest of District 5, with their goal being the outskirts of which led out to the sparsely populated farmlands, where there were only miles and miles of dirt and patches of tilling and crops. I think that's been about 40 minutes, so I apologize that we won't get to the end of the story there. There were about 3 pages left. First, let me say, writing a short story is not as easy as most people think. And this is a lengthy short story and like a dialogue-heavy short story. So the author, Yuto, you should feel really proud, seriously. This is great. It's great that you did this. It's great that you revised it twice. That's awesome. You should feel really, really proud. Like I said, my main piece of advice here would just be to tighten up some of the sentences. It's really okay if you want to keep the sentences long. That's not a problem. But you just have to make sure that the reader can still follow them, even if they are going to be long. And yeah, just as I pointed out with a few sentences, they're just a little bit wordy is all. If you just cut out some of the words, tighten up the action a little bit so that it's easier to follow, I think that'll really elevate the story on the whole. This has the makings of a good love story, right? I sense the romance between Ansel and Pavel, and it's pretty believable too, because like there's tension between them also, so it's not a picture perfect romance. So this has the makings of an interesting love story, right? With the setting, the characters. Yeah, overall, like I said, I just think it needs a little bit of tightening up, but this is neat. And like I said, you should feel proud for this. This is great. So I just want to thank you one more time for submitting that short story to us. And that's going to take us into our last piece for today, which is another poem. This is a poem by Caitlin. It's called The Collector. As far as content warnings go for this one, Caitlin said implied murder and mental illness. They also left a pretty long note with just some context about them and about the piece. Looks like they're 18 years old. They say, songwriting is my forte. I still struggle with writing and understanding poetry. I think that's true for a lot of writers. I think that's true for even the professionals from time to time, right? I wrote this poem in 2 weeks for a poetry competition. It was highly commended, and I'm proud of it, but also know it's a bit sloppy and probably has a ton of amateur poet mistakes. My own analysis, supposed to take the reader into the mind of a disturbed individual, using juxtaposition and jarring nonsensical imagery. In the end, to imply, I might pause there actually, so that we don't give too much away. Let's just read it for ourselves and see what we can garner. The Collector. I collect light bulbs and store them in a suitcase so I can always unpack a bright idea. I let go of pennies as a reminder that travel is always possible. I burn postcards and snort the ash to feel French high. I collect the smoke in jars and drink it through a straw to be reignited. I collect pieces of string in hopes one day I'll have enough to tie my life together. I collect yesterday's tears as tomorrow's smile always evades my grasp. I collect leprechauns and throw their gold in the river and bathe in the pot. I collect vinyls so I can eat off them and make pottery with the record player. I collect shells because the fragments of my soul are too scattered to find. I collect the dreams of others in order to escape the twistedness of my own mind. I tear out the endings of books, staple them to the front, and return them to the library. I collect the fines alongside polite ladies and gentlemen's gritted grins. I collect firewood from shipwrecks and the screams of ghost pirates along the flames. I collect bird bones and feed them to my taxidermy cat so one day it'll fly. I collect broken pens so no one can read my insanity, but I don't collect stamps because I've not completely lost it. If I'd ever had a lover, I'm sure a locket of my hair would be collected off their dead body next to the fingerprints I'd collected of strangers from the underground. Half my collection lies under the patio pavement, and you collect relief in fiction, a place where you gain and keep everything. Okay, so pretty neat, actually. A strong first impression this poem has made on me, I will say. I definitely think the imagery or the visuals is sort of the strongest element working here in this poem. Even the first stanza, like, speaking of good hooks, that's just like a funny first line. I collect light bulbs and store them in a suitcase so I can always unpack a bright idea. That's just like funny. And like, if the tone of the poem didn't change as it went along, it's kind of cute actually, right? And separate from, the feelings that it gives off, this poem almost kind of like begs to be illustrated. Like, I just feel like, I don't know, I'm not an illustrator by trade, but I feel like as I read the poem that illustrators would just have a fun time with a lot of the visuals that are in here. Like storing light bulbs and then unpacking them as ideas, or collecting smoke in jars and drinking it through a straw to be reignited. Those are just like fun, interesting visuals, right? It'd be fun to see them drawn, especially alongside the text a la Shel Silverstein, right? So yeah, that's definitely the strongest piece at play here is I think as the author put it, the nonsensical imagery, right? And like I said, like, with even a little bit of change, if even a few things were different as the poem progressed, this would just sound like sort of a fun nonsense poem rather than, the speaker is literally insane and a murderer. There is, of course, a lot of repetition going on here. I appreciate that the lines are pretty lengthy because it does sort of separate each repeated phrase. At the same time, you could probably rewrite the poem so that it just says, I collect, at the top of each stanza. And then, of course, you can change it up because not every line does start with I collect. So, for example, in this stanza, you could say, I collect shells because the fragments of my soul are too scattered to find the dreams of others in order to escape the twistedness of my own mind. And then I tear out the endings of books because obviously it starts different. That's not a collection anymore. And I do like that visual. I tear out the endings of books, staple them to the front, and return them to the library. Evil. Pure evil, right? Not just because, like, oh, that would spoil the story, but just the idea of mutilating a book and then returning it to the library in that condition. Despicable. You can tell I'm a reader based on my strong feelings about that one line. So yeah, just the repetition is something to consider, whether it's like always necessary to start each line with I collect, or whether the poem would read better without it. Ultimately, that's the author's call to make. And like I said, the lines are pretty long here, so it kind of breaks up the repeated phrases in a way that helps avert monotony. I liked this line: I collect leprechauns and throw their gold in the river and bathe in the pot. Just, there's a lot working in that sentence. First of all, I collect leprechauns, a thing that doesn't exist. That's funny. And then the idea of throwing their gold away and using the pot to bathe in. It's like, for one thing, you could just bathe in the river, right? Or you could use the gold to buy another bath, assuming any of this was real in the first place, right? Which it's not, because leprechauns don't exist. So there's just a lot at play in that sentence, and I find that funny. And then again, that next line, that also just feels like one that's begging to be illustrated. I collect vinyls so I can eat off of them and make pottery with the record player. That's just funny. Are there any other lines I want to highlight? Let me take a look here. This line felt a little bit too on the nose. I collect the dreams of others in order to escape the twistedness of my own mind. I think there's a more metaphorical way you could say that, or like, it already is metaphorical because obviously you can't literally collect dreams, but I think there's a more symbolic way to say it. I'll put it that way. This line was kind of interesting, as if the speaker were a tax collector. I collect firewood from shipwrecks and the screams of ghost pirates prolong the flames. Again, I think that's neat. The bird bone line. I collect bird bones and feed them to my taxidermy cat so one day it'll fly. Freaking creepy. Super creepy visual. And I think that definitely, like, I don't know. That kind of feels like the shift. And it's like, honestly, I wish the I collect the dreams line. I wish that line were more like the bird bone line. I think there's a more unsettling way to say this, right? If you wanted to have an unsettling shift there. Yeah. But yeah, that line is just creepy, and it's effective because it's weird and unnerving. I collect broken pens so no one can read my insanity. Again, just sort of a little bit on the nose. And this line was funny, but I don't collect stamps because I've not completely lost it. If I ever had a lover, I'm sure a locket of my hair would be collected off their dead body. Yeah, sorry to keep saying the phrase on the nose again. Next to the fingerprints I'd collected of strangers from the underground, half my collection lies under the patio pavement. I guess that line is, kind of cryptic enough. And you collect relief in fiction, a place where you gain and keep everything. I don't know if I'm sold on that line as the ending, the conclusion of everything that we've read up to this point. I don't know. It's kind of tough. Because, like, it's ironic, but I don't know if it's intentionally ironic, because we assume that this poem is also fictional, that this isn't a literal murderer writing this poem. We suppose, right? I don't know. Maybe the author has some skeletons in their closet, as it were. And I mean, we don't even have to assume that it's all fiction, because obviously some of the visuals here are too fantastical to be taken literally. So yeah, I don't know about the ending personally, but there is a lot of really, really good stuff going on here, truly. One thing I also might consider is the order of some of these lines, right? Like, where, as the author, where do you want the shifts to be? Where do you want it to sound like fun and funny, and where do you want it to sound maybe somber or serious or creepy or unnerving, right? So that's something to consider. Let's go ahead and read the author's interpretation here, or their own analysis. Supposed to take the reader into the mind of a disturbed individual using juxtaposition and jarring nonsensical imagery, in the end to imply that they, collect people and are a serial killer, right? I think we got that impression. I tried to use a few objects like vinyls and shells to show how the narrator is collecting common things, but the reasoning and using of the items shows that their mind is deeply disturbed, and that even while doing normal things, they would never be able to fit in. The last line is kind of a fourth wall break, though, and the point of the whole story about how we all collect fiction and use it to experience things outside of ourselves and our own lives, but that there is also a safe barrier there, the so-called relief. Also, something I noticed after writing is that the objects in the first line of each stanza can refer to body parts, kind of. So light bulbs equal brains, pieces of string equal intestines, shells equal skin, firewood equals hearts. Okay, yeah, I don't think that's like too much of a leap, the symbolism there. But it sounds like the ending was supposed to be intentionally ironic. And if that's the case, I might make that even just a tiny bit more explicit. But maybe not. I don't know. It's tough because each reader is obviously going to have their own interpretation. And maybe, like I said, maybe the order of each line, if you just reorder some of these pieces, maybe that would make the irony sound a little more intentional. Yeah, I do like the idea, though, of collecting fiction rather than collecting relief in fiction, right? Because for some of us, not all fiction is a means of relief, right? Sometimes we read horror and it's not exactly relieving, right? But we still enjoy it in a way. But yeah, like I said, as I said with one of the other pieces in this video, maybe I'm being a little bit pedantic, but I actually liked the way the author said it when they said, we all collect fiction and use it to experience things outside of ourselves and our own lives, but that there is also a safe barrier there, the so-called relief. Yeah, but with the build up to that line at the end, it's like, you know, it sounds like the speaker, since they're like a murderer and a crazy, unsafe individual, it's like they're saying that in a creepy, unsettling way where it's like, oh, there's relief in fiction, but the real world is much scarier. That's kind of the way it comes off as it stands. That's my interpretation anyway. And that's kind of just like an unfortunate thought, even if it is true. I don't know. Yeah, maybe it's just that the poem kind of has two clashing tones right now with just the way everything is ordered. There's a little bit of whiplash. Yeah, I think some of it just needs to be streamlined a little bit, go from the cute and fantastical imagery to the more unsettling stuff in a way that's a little bit less sporadic, if that makes sense. But once again, I would love to hear what everybody else thinks on this one. It is a really good piece. I'm glad that it was highly commended because there is a lot to commend here, absolutely. So good job, Caitlin. I hope that you keep writing because there's a lot of really good stuff here. Like I said, the visuals are definitely the strongest piece. I hope that your other poems continue to build off of that strength. So, really good set today, as always. You guys, my lovely viewers, you guys really do astound me. As I emphasized with a lot of these pieces today, just feel proud for having written anything at all, right? For being brave, right? I feel like we saw a lot of that with these pieces, a lot of bravery on display here. But we're going to leave it at that for today. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you to those of you who submitted. Really, really huge thanks to just all of you. You guys are the best. And this is a rough draft or whatever. Goodbye.